You can't please everybody all of the time. And when you serve in a public role, that's not your objective. I think your objective is to serve with honesty, with integrity, to learn from your mistakes, to tell people the truth, and then to let people decide. And I don't have to please everybody. And she was chairing this meeting and just, nursing her newborn baby. And the image really stuck in my mind because I remember thinking, wow, if this is how Iceland is now, and I worked for a software company then, like it was almost all men, and I thought, wow, if this is how this is, I like this place, I can handle the bad weather. We might not all be able to save the world, but we can all kind of speak up and nudge things in the right direction.
Vstúpte s nami do zákulisia, kde sa bežní ľudia nedostanú. A sledujte hru mocných zblízka.
Som Lucia Okšová, šéf-redaktorka Forbesu. A toto sú
Power Players.
Dievča z Kanady sa zamilovalo na Oxforde a presťahovalo sa na Island. Spolu s manželom sa ale dostali do centra politického diania, a to keď vypukol na Islande škandál okolo Panama Papers. Jej manžel sa stal prezidentom a ona prvou dámou Islandu. Eliza Reid nám o tomto svojom unikátnom príbehu prišla porozprávať na Forbes Women Summit do Bratislavy a dnes ju budeme mať spolu s nami aj v podcaste o tom, ako hľadala svoj hlas a ako sa stala globálnou ikonou feminizmu. Moje meno je Lucia Okšová, som šéf-redaktorka Forbesu a vy ste si práve zapli Forbes Power Players.
Podcast Power Players počúvate vďaka nášmu partnerovi Sandberg Capital. Váš partner vo svete Private Equity.
Ja s nami v štúdiu už vítam bývalú prvú dámu Islandu, medzinárodne uznávanú autorku a advokátku za ženské práva Elizu Reid. A tento rozhovor bude v angličtine, určite si ale zapnite titulky, ktoré sme pre vás pripravili v slovenčine. Eliza, let me welcome you here in our Forbes Power Players podcast. I just introduce you as a former First Lady, as a best-selling author, and also as a women's rights advocate. So Eliza, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
It's amazing, and it's been amazing of having you here in Bratislava for Forbes Women's Summit. And you started, we can just get right into the interview.
Okay.
And you started your talk with a presentation where you told the story about your upbringing and about your path from a girl in Ottawa to Iceland and to becoming the first lady of Iceland. So I would just like to trace back to the roots.
Yeah. Shall I just tell you the whole story in a shortened version?
In a shortened version, but
yeah.
What is your family background? I know that your father was an English teacher, right?
That's correct. Yeah, my father is an English professor, and my mother a homemaker, worked always in the home. And I have two younger brothers. And when I was 10 years old, we moved from the outskirts of Ottawa, the capital of Canada, to what we call in Canada a hobby farm, which means it's on land. It was an old house, and they had sheep and chickens and ducks.
So we grew up with animals.
Yeah, but it was more like a hobby. It wasn't their income. Okay. And so I lived there from the age of 10, and my parents still live there on the farm. And I went to university in Toronto, which was the big city in Canada, of course, and studied international relations, which ended up becoming helpful to me. Indeed,
right?
Indeed. And then I went to graduate school at Oxford University in England. And part of that reason was just because I wanted to see the world a little bit, and I wanted to travel.
And you studied history, right?
I studied history at Oxford, and there were quite a few people from Canada who were studying there, but we used to talk about one man from Iceland because we all thought that Iceland sounded really far away and quite different. And in that time, in the last century, it was before Iceland had a tourist boom. So, people knew there was a country called Iceland, but maybe didn't know very much about it at all. And so he formed our own stereotypes of what everyone from Iceland was like.
And he was a student as well.
Yes, he was doing his PhD in history. And that was his dream, right, was to become a history professor. And we met and we fell in love. We had our first date actually during a fundraiser and a raffle where the women would buy tickets and men would draw a ticket out of like a paper cup that they had their names in. And I thought this was a good moment to tempt fate a bit. And so I bought a lot of tickets and I put them almost all in his cup. So they sort of had to draw my name for a date. Anyway, we met and we fell in love, and when he finished his PhD, we moved to Iceland and built a life for ourselves there. And we got married and we had 4 children together. He also has a daughter from his first marriage who was already back in Iceland. And the children were born sort of at two-year increments. And I started working. We can talk about this in more detail, of course, in Iceland, but it's a good system when you have children for both parents to be able to work still. And I worked ultimately as a journalist, doing travel writing, and anything really in the English language for writing for companies and things. And if we fast forward then to 2016, when our children were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old.
2, 4, 6, and 8,
yes,
okay.
It's easy to remember, right, because they're 2 years apart. And things were busy, as you can imagine, just with that side of it. But then I had a lot of projects. My husband had just got tenure, become a full professor at the University of Iceland. So we thought, this is it, we've got our life all planned out for us.
And he followed his dream in researching history and writing books. And
Exactly. So we thought this was great. And we had this, we just moved into a slightly bigger house and it had lots of things broken, but this was going to be, we never were going to move again. And then the Panama Papers scandal broke in April 2016, which was the scandal that affected some world leaders who were implicated with offshore tax havens.
And I remember this scandal as a journalist. We've been covering it all over the news. Even here in Slovakia, we had the Panama Papers on the front page of almost every newspaper. So it's been huge. It's been huge worldwide.
Exactly. And in Iceland, our prime minister at the time was affected by that scandal. So he was on the front cover of the New York Times and these huge papers. And other people may recall that Iceland had a big financial meltdown in 2008. And so the population was very sensitive to financial issues, of course, with that in such recent memory.
And there was some lending with the British banks, right?
Yes, that's right. All of Iceland's banks collapsed. There was issues because they had branches in the UK and the Netherlands, and Iceland had to get IMF loans in order to be able to continue functioning. So ultimately, after Panama, the prime minister had to resign, but there were protests, of course, outside Parliament, and there was negotiations as to, who would call elections, how they would be called, and a lot of detail about the Constitution. And my husband, Gudni, who was writing a book on the presidents of Iceland, was the guy that was called onto the news, because the news just covered these protests for hours, to talk about what was happening. And he was asked because he's an expert and because he wasn't a member of a political party, so he could be quite neutral in his commentary. And I think he could, I'm biased, of course, but I think he could explain quite complex concepts in an easy to understand way for people.
And since he's a professor, he's used to explaining very difficult concepts in a very simplified way.
Exactly.
So it came in handy as well.
And he talks with people. He doesn't talk to people, And
I've seen some videos. He's very charismatic as well.
No, that's nice. So he's on TV, and at the time, he was out, so I'm cooking supper for the kids at home. And then the phone rings, which it never usually rings in the day of mobiles. And it was a man who was a pensioner in an old age home. And he just called to say that he had watched Gudni on television. He had looked his number up in the phone book, as we have, and just thought that he should maybe consider running for president of Iceland. And we had this presidential election that was scheduled for 2 months later. And I remember thinking, well, this isn't an unusual phone call to receive, right? But I didn't think too much of it. And I thought
it was like a joke back at the time.
Yeah, I thought it was flattering, that someone would see him, and there was this election, and I thought I promised to tell my husband. And then I went back to picking up spaghetti on the floor or whatever was going on, and then the phone rang again. And it was somebody else in a different part of the country, in a different age group, who said, I've been watching your husband on television, and he was really good, and he should consider running for president.
But all of the people were ordinary citizens.
Yes.
No political advisors.
Not people we knew either. Okay. So, and I, again, thought this was, to take the time to be so impressed by someone that you find their phone number that you don't know and then deliberately call their home is quite a few steps. And I remember thinking, wow, when Gudni gets home, he's going to be really surprised about these phone calls. And yet, when he got him, he wasn't all that surprised. And he showed me his own phone. And, if people were looking up our number to call, imagine how many people were sending him Facebook messages, text messages, Instagram messages. And he just had this huge almost tsunami of people encouraging him to run.
So there was a big demand.
There was a big demand, and it was like the stars aligned all of a sudden. You know, if it hadn't been for that time in the papers, of course, he was the same person, the same experience, the same skills, but nobody knew who he was. And he all of a sudden was thrust in the spotlight without that intention. But the stars aligned that he had to consider it, and we as a family had to consider it. And then I think you just think, what have we got to lose? You know, if he thinks he can do it a good job, why not just try? And when he decided to do it and he announced that he was running for president, the election was held 7 weeks later. So
let's stop here for a second.
It was fast. Yeah.
It was very fast, and it's an impressive story of how you got engaged, how you got married, how you moved to Iceland, and how it turned all out. He wanted to follow his dream and study history, teach history, and basically he was writing history with you by his side. But I'm really curious about the discussions within your family when you were deciding, because it sounds so encouraging, like, let's try it, let's give it a try, what do we have to lose? But you had a lot of to lose, basically, privacy.
Well, that's a good point, especially when you say privacy. It's interesting, in a sense, and of course, one always maybe remembers things differently in hindsight, right? This is now 9.5 years ago. But as I recall it, there almost wasn't time to think about it. It really, really was. Within 3 or 4 days, a friend was sort of commissioning a poll to find out what people would think. And you really then distill all kinds of questions down to just a few fundamental questions. And one was, how would it affect our children? And that's probably the number one concern. And we thought, again, in Iceland, we have quite a free and open society, and people tend to let the families, especially they were young children, be alone. And so we thought, as long as we stayed focused on them as well and were present as much as we could be, that we wouldn't ruin our children and might even be able to give them some interesting experiences. And then I guess you think about, say, cost, or you hear stories about how expensive it is personally to run for an election, right?
Definitely.
But in Iceland, again, we have very strict campaign sort of finance regulations in terms of donations and things, and we didn't really think that I had to buy some clothes. You know, that's a whole other debate. Is the existing wardrobe of a mother of 4 children versus a presidential spouse candidate, and they're different wardrobes, I'll tell you. You know, but we thought, no, we won't bankrupt our very little, you know, our heavily mortgaged house anyway. And then the last question is, does he want to do it, and does he think he could do a good job? And again, privacy is a really interesting point. We thought, again, more in relation to our children who weren't, say, old enough to be on social media. But again, they're quite good in Iceland, people, about separating the public and private, and giving people some space if they want it. So that wasn't something that I was too concerned about.
You've been speaking about the impact on your family, on your kids, on your husband. But what about the impact on you personally? Because you had your career, you were a journalist, you were writing, traveling the world. You studied at Oxford. And did you deliberately say yes to maybe being for a short amount of time, but being reduced to the role of the First Lady?
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of questions there, and I think I don't know that I really fully thought about it at the time. My first instinct was it was just such an incredible opportunity that I didn't think twice. You know, I probably pushed him more than the other way around almost. But it was a mutual decision, and I was certainly all in from my perspective, because it was such a spontaneous and unexpected opportunity. I just thought we had to go for it.
But were you even thinking about yourself and your role?
Not in that sense, but I also, naively or not, maybe took a lot of things for granted. As you say, I was working, but I was working so I ran my own business doing all kinds of freelance projects. And so I always said, and I said in interviews from the outset, I'm not going to give up my job because my husband got elected to a new one. And I did resign a lot of my freelance sort of corporate projects because I wanted to devote time to serving as First Lady and serving actively as First Lady. But I also wanted to remove any potential conflicts, if I was working for one specific Icelandic organization over another. But for example, I co-founded in 2014 an event called the Iceland Writers Retreat, which I did with a friend where we lead writing workshops in Iceland. And, that's my professional baby. And I thought, I'm not going to give that up at all. And Iceland, to me, Iceland was not a country where I thought people would be concerned about that. Expect me to resign all of my work because my husband got a new job. So I did leave some of them, but I continued to do that work, and I was very active. And then ultimately, and we can talk later on, I ended up doing additional work for a public-private partnership called Business Iceland, which promotes Iceland, I guess broadly speaking, as a brand abroad. And they approached me, which again I think represents Iceland very well, and said, when you travel with us to talk about tourism, investment in energy, literature, anything, we get a lot more media and press, and you're the only person who's not on a salary for doing that. And so they offered me, I wasn't a staff person, but I was on a retainer, like a contract employee, for the last few years as well. And I thought that was important to indicate the value of the work that I was doing.
What was the reaction of your kids, of your parents, of those who were close to you when you simply announced that we are thinking of becoming the president, the first lady, of running in the election and trying it?
I think so. Our friends within Iceland were very encouraging, and it was incredibly touching throughout that whole process to know how many friends you have. And I mean, a cynic might say, of course, you have friends all of a sudden, but it was friends in a different way. Friends who the parents of our children's friends who would, babysit our children, or people who would lend their cars to donate, or people who would organize bake sales, or volunteers would get together and open a campaign office in a village of 500 people.
Like a big network of supporters.
Yeah, and they came out of the woodwork, and I was incredibly touched by that. And then, of course, so many people that you've never met before, right? And our friends abroad who remembered sort of bookish, cardigan-wearing Goodney from grad school would say, wait, he's running for president? And then our families were also incredibly supportive. Goodney's family, who, of course, were in Iceland, were really, really active in many facets of the campaign. And my parents in Canada flew over and also babysat the kids most of the time. And I feel like I traumatized them a little bit because, of course, they don't speak Icelandic. They don't want to drive. It's a new country, a new environment. And there's 2 in primary school, 2 in preschool, and they have football activities and play dates and picky eating requirements and all kinds of things.
So it was adventure for the whole family.
It really was, yeah.
And coming back to the story, your husband was leading in the polls very quickly. So when did you start believing that it's going to happen? Because one thing is running for the office, and the second one is being very close to being elected and then becoming the president and the first lady. Yeah,
it's as you said, I think the first poll had him at 69% support out of 9 candidates. So it was almost like he was leading, and then you just go downhill from there, which is true. The support went down and down and down, which I think isn't necessarily anything against him, but also because people who might have slightly preferred another candidate felt comfortable knowing that if Goodney was their second choice, they would have voted for him, because the system works that it's just one election round and whoever gets the most votes wins. So there's no runoff. Everybody from the outside, once the final list was decided, said, well, he's going to win. But I have to say, from inside the campaign, speaking for me personally, you never take anything for granted, of course. There's a lot of things that can happen, and it's just, I don't think we would ever have that arrogance. And the whole thing was such a whirlwind, and it was so fast that you kind of are flowing along with it. And in some senses, at some points, it felt very isolating. Because if you're tired or stressed or worried, I wouldn't talk to my husband about that, because if I felt that way, how would he feel? He's the one that it's really, really about, that all the pressure is on. And yet everybody around you is working so hard and giving so much of their time. I also felt like I shouldn't talk to any of those people, because then I'm adding more stress to them. So sometimes there was some strange sort of feelings of isolation in that. But it was such a whirlwind. And as I said, there was a feeling sort of from the outset that he was the most likely candidate to win, but you never take that for granted.
When we go back to the election night,
yeah,
what is your first memory?
One of my last memories is, the whole election was very fast, of course. On election night itself, when they were announcing the results, all of the candidates and spouses were up at the television headquarters so they could get the reactions of the candidates as the first results started coming in. We had advisors, and the very first results that came in from one part of the country had Goodney in the lead, but much closer than the polls had said. So the polls had said, I can't even remember now, that he was 20 points ahead by the end. And these first results had him 4 points ahead. Okay. And so I'm sort of smiling, and I feel like I pasted a smile on my face, even though the cameras weren't on me, thinking, okay, well, now I have more close, and my kids won't have to, just thinking of what happens if he doesn't win, and, we'll just deal with that. But then another result came in, and he was ahead again by a little bit more, and one of our advisors said, don't worry, it's okay. And then the results kept coming in, and they were higher and higher. So it was fine. And then we went to the campaign, or, there was a venue that had been rented for the party. And one thing I remember from the end was, of course, you haven't slept in days, and it's really hectic. And my parents, who had been babysitting so much, I said, we got another babysitter for the children, because our kids were too young, really, to do this. And and I said to my parents, will you come to the party? So one of my last images in my mind was leaving at about 3 a.m, and in June in Iceland, the sun doesn't set, so it's still bright sun outside, and walking out of the hotel ballroom and out into the street and turning around, and there are my elderly parents dancing to Uptown Funk on the dance floor. Okay. They really let loose that night, so they were having a good time.
I remember that when we did in the past an interview with former Slovak president, Mrs. Zuzana Čaputová, she remembered back the night when she won the elections as having an enormous weight of responsibility coming down on her chest. And even though everybody was super thrilled around her, she started realizing that this is serious, this is real.
Yeah.
Did you have some similar experience, or did it come maybe later?
I think that's probably a question you'd have to ask my husband for how he felt, because I, as the spouse, I was never going to have that weight of responsibility. But I was very aware of how I was hoping to be a strong support for him, within our marriage, and that he could feel that he could talk to me whenever he wanted to about any issues. But I did spend a lot of time thinking right away of how I wanted to use that moment, because unlike a president who has a very defined job description, in a sense, right? I mean, you can do lots of things within it, but there's certain very specific roles that a president has. But in most places, a president's spouse, if indeed there is a spouse, doesn't have a rule book. And I love rules. Okay. And so, the first thing that I usually do, if I buy a blender, is to read the instructions on how to use it, even if I know how to do it, because I want to know I'm doing it right. And then all of a sudden I was thrust into this role where I didn't know what I was supposed to do or how I was supposed to do it.
So what were the initial expectations from you? What if you would get a handbook or some advisors around you, what did they tell you? At least this is like a First Lady 101. Yeah.
Well, I just thought it was mostly my impression from watching people abroad, which was very often, I suppose, because I'm an English speaker, the American First Lady, who at the time was Michelle Obama. Because even if you look at countries like my home country of Canada, the head of state of Canada was the Queen of England, and we have a Governor General. So it was a different, of course, the spouse of the Prime Minister was there, but that was a different role a little bit. So the American one in a sense, but it's such a visible role. But I thought, I have this chance and I have to use it to be more than a silent, smiling woman next to my husband's side, as if I'm some kind of prop for what he's doing.
And seeing Michelle Obama, I think, was could be an inspiration, right? She used her voice, I feel, very strongly.
For sure. And I think that's because I was really conscious of what image I was portraying both in Iceland and abroad. And I thought in Iceland, we need more female leaders out there. And we have male head of state, but we don't need to reinforce the idea that the women next to them are merely props, And so I spent a lot of time sort of thinking of my identity in that context, because all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, you're Goodney's wife, you're Goodney's wife. And I would say, well, I'm Eliza. And I'm so proud to be Goodney's wife, of course, but I'm also my own person. And so, you spend a lot of time thinking about this dichotomy, because you're also, in a sense, it's like you're in a marriage, you're equals and you contribute equally to decisions and what you're doing. And if you're a president and a spouse, that is not equal, right? The president is the one who runs things and is in charge. And it's a different dynamic, even though he would never, explain it that way, I'm sure.
Did you feel invisible during some times?
Yes, certainly not in relation to my husband at all. But there are moments when you would go to events or attend things, and people would just, it was like you're invisible. People would just walk right past. I've had people walk past me in receiving lines and shake my husband's hand and then walk right past me, or just kind of approach and sort of nod to you and then go to talk to the main person. And I don't think people do this on purpose by any stretch. It just, it's kind of the light that is shining from the head of state is so bright that people forget other individuals. And I understand that role of the head of state is, of course, the most important role. But when there are also expectations as the First Lady that I'm going to go and attend things with them and do things, I thought, well, if I'm going to go on a state visit with them, I'd also like to do events and to speak. When we came here to Slovakia on a state visit, I participated in panels with Mr. Riesman on gender equality and what we're doing as well, because that to me was important, that rather than kind of stand next to Goodney the whole time and not say anything, that we could go off and talk about other issues while he's all doing the important, vital things that you have to do on a state visit.
And I imagine that was quite an interesting dynamic there, because at least from our Slovak point of view, this is something that we haven't experienced before. We didn't have a female president before Zuzana Čaputová, so we never even had any procedures or protocols for the first gentleman.
I'm
so
sure.
Mr. Riesman was definitely in a new position.
Right, exactly. And I think, sometimes I am asked how I would encourage other first ladies to do things or not. And part of me wants to say, I think that we need more female presidents, not more first ladies. Yeah, exactly. I think that it's great that they stay active. But, this was the position in which I found myself happily. And I really, really wanted to make the most of that. And what I try to do now, I think the message that helps me share now as a public citizen and in this role is twofold, I guess. One is that we all face unexpected moments in life that are positive changes, positive bends in the road or developments, but that's also intimidating. And we have to kind of acknowledge that we might not know what we're doing right away, but we have to still lean into those moments and try to use them when we are given them. And the second part that I try to give to people is to remind everybody that we all are role models and that we all have an influence. And I wasn't an elected official. I didn't have any, obviously, constitutional responsibility, budget, people working for anything like that. But I had this sort of invisible platform and influence, and I tried to use it. And maybe not everybody has the same kind of platform, but we do within our communities and our friendship groups and our schools and our workplaces. And I think that those role models are really important. And we have to decide whether we want to be positive role models or negative role models. And I think that there's a lot of pressure nowadays we've become a very binary world. I either agree with everything you say or I agree with nothing that you say. And I think that in some senses change is that way. I think if I can't revolutionize the world, I'm not even going to try because I'll never achieve anything. I think maybe I can just do a little bit. I can't tell you as First Lady, I didn't revolutionize the world. I just tried to use the moments that I had within that to have a positive impression on the people that I met. And hopefully that kind of nudges things in the right direction. And I hope that other people remember that they have those moments too.
Podcast Power Players počúvate vďaka nášmu partnerovi Sandberg Capital. Váš partner vo svete private equity.
I imagine that you met a lot of world leaders and their spouses, either female or male. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe remember some meeting that was very significant for you? Maybe that you found an ally or a very interesting first lady or first gentleman or a world's leader that impacted you and your view?
I mean, it was one of the things I enjoyed the most was meeting different people, because we realized that all these people and these faces that we see on television, they're regular people like the rest of us who have fears and doubts and dreams and who make mistakes, but by and large are trying their best. It was a privilege to be here in Slovakia and meet President Čaputová and Mr. Eastman when we were there. Really got along well with both of them. Then I met other people like, for example, Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya from Belarus, whose husband, Serhei, was, of course, imprisoned by the Lukashenko regime and who had to flee, of course, Belarus and then stepped up under those circumstances to lead the democratic government for Belarus. And what an incredible, brave, intelligent woman. And I really, really admire people like that who I've met. And I mean, there's too many to mention almost. And then again, the spouses of world leaders, because it is an unusual circumstance. So I have stayed in touch with several of them as well and try to meet them when I can.
Let's talk about the media's perception of first ladies.
Yeah.
I don't want to ask what was the most irritating question that you ever got, but were you asked more often about your clothes than about your ideas?
Very often, yeah. Maybe without being asked, it was the report. The day after the election, I did a lot of interviews in Canada because I was from Canada, and so this was on the news. And in my mind at least, almost every journalist asked me, did you ever imagine when you were growing up on the farm in Canada that you would be the First Lady of Iceland? And I remember thinking, why? Of course not. And was my dream to marry somebody who would achieve something? Of course not. And yet everybody seemed to ask me that question. And certainly there were moments, where I was asked, when I'd show up at events and I was asked what I was wearing, not what I thought about something. And I, in a sense, that was probably an area that I was the most insecure about, because I'm a pretty confident person overall. I can talk about my ideas, but I'm not that interested in fashion and clothing, and I'm not very good at it. But of course, I didn't want to change my persona and start being only concerned about fashion because I was in this role. But of course I wanted to serve with dignity and be appropriate in terms of what I was doing. So I sort of learned the balance of that. And I also began to use the influence that I had in that area. So Michelle Obama in her memoir said something like, if the media were going to follow her every move, she was going to take them places. And I started wearing, once I was with a friend in a secondhand clothing shop to support the Red Cross. And I bought a jacket, that was secondhand. And I wore it to Iceland's equivalent of the Oscar Awards. And that came out that I wore secondhand. And it was on the BBC and it was on all sorts of places. And so then I started wearing a lot of secondhand clothing. And I wore a secondhand dress to the election night when Gudni was reelected. And I wore it to receive the President and First Lady of Germany when they came on a state visit. And I thought, well, people are going to ask what I'm wearing. And I can say that I bought this secondhand, which is good for the environment. And I supported the Red Cross at the same time. And so I tried to do things like that.
Symbolic.
Yeah, and send those messages. And of course, talk about what I was doing. But I remember a tiny story from before my husband announced he was running for president. And we had to do, of course, a campaign flyer, with our happy, well-dressed color coordinated family. And so somebody had a stylist call the house. And, you know, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm sure, you know, I'm changing a diaper and I'm like gesturing to the kids that the TV is on too loud and someone's yelling, you know, he pushed me, in the chaos of a house. And I'm standing there and the stylist says to me, can you describe your personal style? And I'm thinking,
in a rush.
And I said, well, my maternity trousers still fit very well, and I last bought shoes 5 years ago. And there's sort of silence at the other end of the line, you know, like, I think I have to come over earlier and talk to you. And so it was a real kind of unusual world in that sense, you know, but it's part of the adventure.
Even though we are part of the media, I think it's very unfair, superficial and irritating to see how differently media address male and female leaders or first ladies and gentlemen. Whether you look at the president of the United States, Donald Trump, whatever his opinions, his views, or his looks are, you also have Melania Trump being seen as cold or being reported as something. You can have Michelle Obama with all the amazing things she has done, and still the media discuss whether she is strong enough, slim enough, whether she's working out too much. So there is always some discussion and some objectification of the women.
Definitely.
Can you fight it somehow from the position of the elected official or from the position of a politician?
I think you try to point it out. I remember doing an interview once. My husband did something on the campaign, to interrupt, in the election before 2016, in 2012, the woman who came in second in the election, who was running, was pregnant with her third child when she ran, and she took 2 weeks off in the campaign. She had the third child. She went back to the campaign. And it was all over the news, of course, and she was constantly asked, even in Iceland, where we're leaders in gender equality, you know, how do you think you're going to manage being a mother of all these children and president? She had a good answer. Now, my husband has 5 children, right? And we had 4 together. He had a stepdaughter, his daughter, and our youngest was 2 years old. And nobody would ask him, as president, do you think you can handle being a father of 5 and also the responsibilities of being president? And so he often, at the end of the campaign, of an event, would say, after the questions, isn't anyone going to ask me whether I can balance being a father of 5 and do all this? Because I have a good answer for that. And so he sort of called it out. In the other way around. And sometimes in interviews, I remember doing an interview with an American journalist who was first interviewing my husband and then going to interview me, and he said to me, oh, now you have 4 children, and how do you balance that busy home life with everything? And I said to him, I'm curious to know what my husband answered when you asked him that question, because we parent equally and we make these decisions. And of course he hadn't asked my husband that question. So I tried to sort of just point out little things that might have been double standards. And to his credit, I've been interviewed by him several times since then, and every time he brings that up. So he remembered it, which is good. Calling it out a bit, which sounds quite aggressive, and hopefully I'm not being mean about it, but which is a very feminine thing to say. I hope nobody is offended by what I say.
I hope I'm nice.
Yeah,
Canadian
I hope I'm
enough
still very
words.
nice. Yeah.
But were you able to do it from the beginning, or did you have to learn it on the way?
Of course not. No, and I think that's important. You know, there's so many things where I thought, oh, I missed that opportunity, or I should have spoken up, or even just when I would make suggestions for ideas or things, that everything is so new that I didn't question very much. You know, I didn't question what I was supposed to do or where I was supposed to go, because I thought, if someone said, oh, you go here, or someone said you need, on a state visit, you need to have matching gloves and a matching handbag, and I was thinking, like, I don't have gloves. I don't know. I have one handbag and no gloves.
I have matching ideas.
Yeah, and you don't question it, of course. But then once you find your way a little bit in that part, then you start to speak up more. And I think that's also an important learning point for people, is to say, you don't have to get it right the first time, right? And you're going to make mistakes. And it's something that we need to say to women anyway, because I do feel that in leadership roles, women are given less leeway. and they come into a position where all people make mistakes. People of all genders make mistakes. And maybe a woman will come in and make a mistake and will say, see, that's why we shouldn't have them in these positions, because they just mess up. And I think that, you know, again, the more women we see in these positions, the less one woman has to bear the weight of an entire gender on her shoulders in terms of what you can achieve.
Did you ever have to, or did you ever want to defend yourself legally? Let's say nowadays there is, I think, like a huge scandal about American bloggers claiming very atrocious things about French First Lady Brigitte Macron.
Yeah.
They're basically telling that she's not a woman and asking for some proofs, which is insane.
Yeah.
And there is this unprecedented thing that the French president basically sued those, and the French Republic, I think, sued those bloggers and calling it out as well.
No is the short answer. And again, Iceland is a much smaller country. You don't have the same international profile that countries like France have. And despite obviously some circumstances of comments, it's not the same. So within Iceland as well, I didn't feel that anything that bad. Of course, you get online abuse, but not enough that I felt taking those measures. And in a sense, I felt a little bit protected in Iceland because the Icelandic language is not my first language. And so if I ever read anything online, which of course you don't do it that often, if you read something that was negative, I have such an innocent vocabulary in Icelandic that I think, I don't know what that word means. It doesn't look in the context like it's very nice about me. So I'm not going to Google what it means. I don't really care.
As you said, you learned a lot on your way. And you mentioned earlier that there were moments when you felt invisible, that you were maybe standing in a line, someone shook the hand of your husband, and they didn't even notice you were there. Did you change something along the way as you learned?
You know, that hand shaking example is a real life example. And I remember after it would happen sometimes, I'd be grumpy at the end of these events, you know, and I'd be grumpy mostly at myself. And I'm not sure if I was grumpy at myself for not doing something about it, not saying something about it, or if I was grumpy that I thought in the first place that someone should have shaken my hand. Because I remember thinking, well, I'm not the president. People aren't here to meet me. You know, I'm co-hosting this event, but why? Doesn't really matter if they shake my hand.
Out of politeness,
who
at
cares?
least.
Of course, you know, when I think about that objectively, but you start to rationalize things. And I know, and I thought, I can't tell anybody about this because it sounds so incredibly petty, and it's ridiculous. And you know, in the grand scheme of things, it is small. You know, it is what we call these microaggressions, right? But if it was kind of added to the sort of mound of self-doubt that I would feel of like, maybe am I doing this right? Am I maybe I'm speaking up too much? Maybe I shouldn't try to have such a presence. You know. That gradually I thought, no, I'm co-hosting this event. Like I should shake everybody's hand. And I realized that I wasn't really taking up the space. Like my energy or my aura didn't resonate. And again, there's a simple solution to that. And that is that people would come in and shake my husband's hand and they'd start walking by and I'd say, hello, welcome. And I would say something and it wasn't mean. And they'd say, oh, hello, and shake my hand. And it was nothing, there was no confrontation, of course. There was nothing big. But to me, it's more like it's sort of symbolic of some of those things that, of course, some of the criticism that I would have faced was, I'm an attention seeker, or who do I think I am? I'm not the president, et cetera, et cetera.
And was this only in your head, or did you?
No, that would have been, sort of online
the feedback online,
but a minority, definitely minority, and I just disagree with. I reject those accusations, and so you can't please everybody all of the time. And when you serve in a public role, that's not your objective. I think your objective is to serve with honesty, with integrity, to learn from your mistakes, to tell people the truth, and then to let people decide. And I don't have to please everybody, but I have to serve with dignity and to let the office, or even in these unofficial roles sort of with dignity and to represent Iceland well on the international stage. And I think I wasn't perfect, but I think I did those things overall well.
You were finally able to use your voice out loud to take the initiative, and you started promoting gender equality issues. You wrote a book about Icelandic women.
Yes.
When was this happening? When were you writing the book, and how did you and why did you even decide to write a book?
Well, the idea for that book came about during the pandemic when everything shifted, because of course, as a first lady, I wasn't traveling around Iceland or traveling around the world or speaking at events or anything like that. The timing had shifted, and so all of a sudden, it gives rise to more ideas. And Iceland had the world's first democratically elected female head of state, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, and she turned 90 in April 2020, sort of right at the peak of the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, there was going to be a big party and all that was canceled. And it was all over the news, and people were sharing their memories of Vigdís and what they thought of her. And I remember, as someone who grew up in Canada, thinking, in Canada, I had no idea that that there was this female president in Iceland. I didn't think anything about it.
She was the president for 16 years,
For 16
right?
years, from 1980 to 1996, which is my kind of formative years. I knew that Margaret Thatcher was prime minister of the UK. There weren't many female role models. And I just remember thinking, wow, it's a shame that in many parts of the world, people have forgotten the story of Vigdís. And it sparked an idea not to speak specifically about her, but to profile women in Iceland, because we are closest to closing the gender gap, according to the World Economic Forum, and have been for 16 years now. And I thought it might be interesting to explore what that means. What does it mean if you're a mother or an entrepreneur or a politician or an athlete or an artist in quote unquote the world's best country for women? And at the same time, I wanted to explore what I had been doing as the First Lady and what that meant for my identity. And so the book is a number of interviews with women from all walks of life, and not the famous people. I wanted people that we could all relate to. But then it also shares my story of becoming First Lady and what I tried to do with it. And in fact, writing that book was part of that process, right? That I remember thinking, am I allowed to write a book? What does it say in my rule book? And again, there is no rule book, so I guess I was allowed to. But that was an important, because that to me was a next step professionally from what I had done before. And I was very careful not to use the office of the president in any way when I was writing the book. And I didn't, I didn't use any drivers or, I just did everything myself. And to me, again, that was part of that process. And as far as I'm aware, I didn't, there was certainly no big controversy in the fact that I'd written a book when I was serving as First Lady. And again, I would have been very happy had there had been to explain what it was, right?
In the book, you started with telling a story of the strike of Icelandic women in 1975, and recently it was 50 years anniversary of that strike. So can you tell us more about why this moment changed maybe the history of equality for the world, maybe?
Yeah, it's seen a bit as a watershed moment in Iceland, and in 1975 when women said, look, we're going to take a day off. And now we call them strikes, but then they called it a day off again because some women thought the word strike sounded very communist, and they didn't want to do that. And that in and of itself to me shows an interesting point about how you look at the bigger picture. You don't focus on these details when you all want the same bigger thing. And just women refused to work that day, that whether that was paid work or work with their children or in the home. And of course the country shut down. And 90% of the country's women took part in this day. And it really galvanized the population, to know that we all make a difference. And that together we can make a difference. And 5 years later, of course, Vigdís was elected, but it also led to a women's list political party in first municipal and then parliamentary elections, because they said there aren't enough women on the lists here. And people said, well, that's because people don't vote for women, it's okay. And they said, well, we'll do a list, and it's just women. And guess what? They got people elected, and then that started to change. And when more women are elected, then there's more family-friendly policies, etc. So it had a big difference, but 50 years later, half a century later, we've made tremendous strides, and yet we haven't closed the gap. And we see a global backlash in many areas. So regularly, including, of course, now on the 50th anniversary, there are strikes held in Iceland to remind people that we need to still work at this. And in Iceland now, the emphasis a lot is on the eradication of gender-based violence, which still exists in Iceland as it does anywhere and is a huge impediment to achieving equality, as well as including non-binary women and trans women in the discussion, who are, a big group that it faces a lot of discrimination and higher risk areas. So it's designed, again, to remind us all that we need to be really aware of what we're doing, that the equality is a choice. It's not something that just happens on its own accord, or at least it doesn't happen fast enough. And part of that is also showing that it is something that benefits people of all genders. It's not something that is just good for women and for nobody else, or just good for women and worse for men. It's better for men. I have yet to meet a father in Iceland who said, I hated taking paternity leave. I hated spending that time with my children.
So what is the special about paternity leave or maternity leave, the parental leave, as it is said in Iceland?
So the system in Iceland, which is paid for by the government through our taxes, of course, is what's called a use it or lose it. So in two-parent households, one parent can't take all of the leave that is allocated. You have two different sections, and then a third section you can split as you wish. And you don't have to do it, but the idea is that the default isn't that a mother takes all of the leave. Not only does that increase the bond of fathers with children, which there's lots of research that shows how much it does and the positive benefits there, it introduces fathers, to have a good understanding of what it's like to raise a child and a baby and a newborn. And then in the workplace, employers are less likely to discriminate against women, thinking, I can't hire her, she's just going to go off and have babies and not go back, right?
Because men can do that too,
because men are doing that too. It's not a perfect system, again, I hate to say that, but that's the idea behind it.
My husband was on a parental leave longer than I was.
Yeah, as was mine, see, and it's great, right?
It was amazing, at least it worked for our family.
That's right, and I like that point too, that it's still choice. You're still it's not the government saying you can only have the money if this takes this many and this takes. It's just a way of sort of reminding people that that's the options, and then you are flexible with it.
So what are the other laws that enabled women to get more into politics, let's say, or more into managerial functions?
So again, some of these laws, the idea isn't to dictate value systems, but it's to kind of level the playing field, right? And it's to provide more equal opportunities. And we do not have quota laws for our parliament, although we do have a party list system, and some parties have quotas within their own party list. We do have a law that you have to prove equal pay for equal work. It's an imperfect law again, but I think even just the idea that was introduced is interesting. We have a law on the boards of publicly traded companies so that you need to have, 60-40 gender balance. And I think a lot of these, you can debate the efficacy of some of these laws and I think that shows a couple of points. So one, you might not get it right the first time, right? Some of the board law only applies to new boards that are created, not all, things aren't always perfect. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And it also signals a desire and a wish on behalf of, whichever government is implementing it. And in Iceland, these are coalitions made up of many parties, that we want to create equal opportunities for everyone. We want to level the playing field. And that gender equality is an important priority. So there's also gender budgeting. So when they're creating budgets for all the ministries, that is even done with a gender lens. So farms, and we have a strong agrarian population in Iceland. Farms had traditionally been registered in the man's name, the husband's name, when of course anybody who works on a farm knows that it's pretty shared labor in all kinds of areas. And so maybe if there were benefits claimed or things, they would be claimed under the man's name. And so they would examine this with a gender lens to actually be fair in terms of how their budgets are being allocated and created. And there's another law that Iceland's introducing, gender bonds, which has to do with finance and lending, which I've not studied enough and cannot answer in more detail for you.
But this is very interesting. Does it mean that it encourages women to be the owners as well, to be registered as the owners of the land and of the companies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure in terms, I know that there's laws in Iceland, for instance, you can't actually have joint bank accounts in Iceland, and that has to do with women, you know, when you're earning your own money, that you still get to control your own money. But it has to do with just being aware of how in bureaucracies, people are kind of navigating in one traditional way to not forget what that actually means on the ground in different areas.
One thing that caught my attention, you said that the publicly traded companies should have board quotas on women.
Boards.
60 to 40. Why not 50-50?
Well, it could be, because if you have 5 people on your board, so it's more for if you have an odd number of board members.
It's more like a practical issue.
Yeah. And again, you know, that's just for boards. We're not amazing in Iceland in terms of senior women. I remember when I was First Lady, I often used to present awards in association with the Association of Women in Business in Iceland, that they'd launched an initiative to encourage private sector, municipalities, public sector companies to commit personally to achieving around 40-60 minimum gender balance at their senior executive levels by 2027. And every year we'd present awards to organizations that had achieved it and to new organizations that had signed on. And that was everything from universities to healthcare clinics, municipalities, and of course private companies. And what I liked about that too was you would see that to just receive a certificate with 50 other companies in a row, they would often send the CEO of the bank, or the head of the public broadcaster. And those are busy people, right, who are running these companies. And that to me signaled an important message, as does this whole thing. It's that snowball effect of like, wait, is everybody else doing it? We better do it too. And that is, I think, a cumulative benefit in Iceland, is when more people start to talk about it, right? That more people start to want to go to the party as well. In your book, you write more about Hala Tómasdóttir. I hope that I pronounced it right. Just a short background. She moved back to Iceland from the USA, where she worked in the business world, in Mars, PepsiCo, big companies. And you, in your book, you describe a scene where she is, I think, breastfeeding during a meeting. Yes. And she was in charge of that meeting. Yes. In a room full of men. Yes. And no one even blinked an eye. No one made any sarcastic comments. No one made any joke. Honestly, I can't imagine that in Slovakia, which is sad. Yeah. How is it possible? Is it? Again, I think and I think you see that in the other Nordics as well. That I remember it because it was right after I moved to Iceland. I was in my 20s. Children weren't on the horizon, immediate horizon for me, and she was chairing this meeting, and just nursing her newborn baby. And I the image really stuck in my mind because I remember thinking, wow, if this is how Iceland is now. And I worked for a software company then, like it was almost all men. And I thought, wow, if this is how this is, I like this place. I can handle the bad weather. And certainly something like one of the most natural things in the world of nursing a baby is kind of done anywhere. And there's a wonderful postscript to that story. And I don't know if you recognize the name of that woman who was nursing the baby then when I first moved to Iceland. And she is now president of Iceland. She won the election after my husband decided not to run again. So doesn't that show you how Iceland is small as well, in a sense? So that's the same woman. That's a great end to the story, and which of course I didn't know it. I wrote it in that first book, and definitely. Which brings me to my next question. You said that Iceland is the country in the world that is the closest to close the gender gap. Yeah. And right now, I think that Iceland might be the only country in the world that has both female leaders, the prime minister and the president. Is this even a topic in Iceland amongst people? Absolutely. One, because we haven't achieved gender equality. There's still, there's political roles, which is great. We have, I think, 1 or 2 women who are CEOs of companies that are traded on the stock exchange. We have gender-based violence, of course. There are the women's shelter is very often full. Our universities is 2/3 women. And that's a gender imbalance the other way, right? We need to encourage our men and boys to continue their further education. And that's, I think, another example of why important this is. This isn't about women achieving all the top. It's about everybody trying to live to their full potential. So the advantage in politics, at least, when you have women in so many roles, is that they get to be women with these opinions, not women, and representing all women and being the woman who bears the weight of sort of gender equality on her shoulders. Now they get to focus. There are 3 women leading the 3 political parties that are forming the government in Iceland. They're all very different women, different ages, different political perspectives. And the good thing about that is then you're not, having them run things because they're women. It's because you support or disagree with their various political priorities.
And it's so great that you can even choose between various women and their political styles and agendas. I mean,
right. And that's the ideal, is that people can come through because of their talent and their abilities and when people like them, and not because of their gender.
So Eliza, you spoke about the book that you started writing during the pandemics, but I know that you've been busy lately as well, and you wrote 2 more books, or at least one is published already and the other one is in the creative process. So please tell us more about that.
Well, I wrote a book that's published in English, at least in Icelandic for now, a murder mystery called Death of a Diplomat in the UK, Death on the Island in North America. And it's just a classic murder mystery set in Iceland, and I wanted to try that genre as a professional challenge to me. I think it has strong female characters, but just an interesting murder mystery. And then I've written a book called The First Lady Next Door, which is a story of my time as First Lady that will come out in May 2026, in English at least, hopefully other languages. And it has that message that I've been trying to share with you now, which is that we get these unexpected moments in life and we have to grab hold of them. And so I hope that it's funny stories, a little bit of kind of behind the scenes of the life of a First Lady, but I hope that readers leave that one feeling happy and inspired.
And I know that during your times as the First Lady, when you started speaking about gender equality and these issues, you've been hesitating about whether it is right to use the platform as the First Lady because you got that platform thanks to your husband. Yeah. And when you spoke about this paradox during the Women's Summit, there was an instant idea that popped into my head, like, would anyone ever question it if you were a man? Would even you question?
So true. No, it's very true. And you think, I'm a First Lady, so I'm supposed to talk about access to healthcare and orphans. And, if you said, what are the issues that a First Lady cares about? In our minds, we jump to certain issues, right? And they're all important issues, really important issues. But they reinforce the sort of soft femininity of what women are supposed to be. And so I often tried to, I did lots of events and tried to speak up about lots of things, but I also tried to speak up about things that maybe I had personal experience in that weren't always the traditional things. So gender equality, entrepreneurship, innovation, clean energy, those kind of things too, because again, I wanted to kind of confound expectations about what a First Lady is supposed to be.
Did you ever get a surprising reaction?
Yeah, I was sometimes, encouraged when we'd be traveling places. People would say, well, okay, your husband will do this and you'll read a book to children. and again, I remember thinking, my husband is wonderful with children and, comes from an educator's background. And I remember thinking, wow, if he went to school and read to children, what a great image that would be for other people. And I didn't always win those battles, but I would try to mention at least.
But that would be an interesting twist if he would read the book to children and you could learn something new about the country's innovation or startup hubs or something. Right.
And he did, and I did go to innovation centers and startup hubs. I remember in Finland and Estonia and, in Slovenia and he has been to many, many schools. So it wasn't always that was happening at the same time. But those are the kind of things that I try to do. Because also, we have such short attention spans. So we're not reading all the speeches that people do. We're not paying attention to the whole visit. We see the reels that summarize a whole day in 30 seconds or the little photo clips. And that's what I tried to think of, is the photo that I want of me at the end of this visit kind of gazing at some art, or is the photo of me speaking to a big group? And that's what I tried to think of, that output. Our state visits were only in North America and Europe. And of course, one is very respectful of the certain situations, but there are always groups of people that find that interesting. So, as I said, Slovenia is, they're very high on the gender equality list as well. And I spoke to women entrepreneurs there, but also here in Slovakia, I went with Mrs. Riesman and we did this panel on gender equality. And it's also a nice opportunity to give that attention, I hope, to different groups that might not always get it. We also spoke to, when we were here in Bratislava, my husband and I with him then spoke to queer activists in Iceland, in Slovakia, excuse me. It was right after the killings at Teplaren, and that was important as well for us to do that.
2022. Mm-hmm. In your presentation during our Women's Summit, you said that equality is a discipline and it must be maintained, that it is not the final destination that is once achieved and the work is done.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, a very important message at seeing the trends on social media, seeing those young boys admiring people like Andrew Tate and others, internet celebrities that really are, honestly, it's a frightening trend that we are seeing right now. And even some politicians are endorsing it or applauding it, even Slovak politicians, which is very scary and unfortunate.
Very scary.
How would you address that issue? What can be done?
I would go back again to the point that I made, that we might not all be able to save the world, but we can all kind of speak up and nudge things in the right direction. In Afghanistan, we're seeing a gender apartheid. Women don't have access to the internet. They can't speak outside the home. They can't, some of the most extreme examples of misogyny. And I'm telling you these teeny tiny little microaggressions about being asked about my clothes and some ideas or not shaking hands. And you can't compare those in any way. But it's all this indication of somehow diminishing, reducing, marginalizing, silencing women and women's voices and contributions. And I question the men who want to silence these women. What are they so afraid of? Why are they so insecure about I think it stems down to an insecurity about their own positions in society. I think that, and I think that most men aren't like that. I'm raising 3 boys and I'm married to a wonderful man. There's so many wonderful men out there, and I think we need also to highlight those positive male role models, and we need them as well to call things out. You talk about online and these abuses, and one of the things that I've always done with my sons is, even from a very young age, I've tried to say to them, look, of course I'm their mother and I'm very biased and I think they're wonderful, and I know you'll grow up to be great men and respectful men and kind men, but regardless of any of that, it undoubtedly they will find themselves in environments, this sort of locker room environment, whether that's online, whether that's actually in a locker room or this sort of male-only environment. And I won't be in those environments, right? They will find themselves in those environments and they will hear comments and they will hear these remarks, and they need to have the courage to say, that's not funny, or that's not okay, or why would you think that? And to speak up about those things. And I think that is really challenging. And that's, when I was 13 or 14, I would never have probably spoken up about injustices that I saw. I would have just been happy that it wasn't happening to me. But anybody who has been on the receiving end of attacks knows that even if it's one person against you and there's 10 other people watching it, you not doing anything, you feel like it's 11-1. And so I think these online things, the Andrew Tates of the world, the people committing that abuse are a small minority, but there's a huge swathe of people who aren't speaking up enough against it to make the targets of that abuse feel like almost everyone is against them. And we need to encourage people to speak up against them, and we also need to work on the people committing the abuse to examine what it is that is making them so unhappy that they need to blame other groups or organizations or lash out at them.
It all comes down back to calling it out again and not being just a bystander.
Right. And that's not easy. I'm not saying that that's easy.
If you could do one thing to enhance equality in the world, what would that be?
I would really just encourage people to use their voices. And so many of us are in privileged positions, right? We have voices that we can use and people who can hear us. And we can't, it's like what I said in my talk yesterday, good enough isn't good enough. And I think, again, in Slovakia, in Iceland, in Canada, in places, there are many people who have it okay. It's not so bad, right? And they have a job now, and they have a family, and they're in a safe family or not, and they can't not speak up just because it's okay for them, because there's so many other people around the world who can't. So we need to, this is the longest what one thing would you say answer, but we need to keep speaking up for those reasons. We need to teach our children to be respectful and kind, and we need to call things out. We need a objective, free media to be able to call things out too. So thank you.
Eliza, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.
Podcast Power Players počúvate vďaka nášmu partnerovi Sandberg Capital, váš partner vo svete private equity.
Toto bol podcast Forbes Power Players, ktorý ste si vypočuli spolu s bývalou prvou dámou Islandu Elizou Reid, ktorá je zároveň autorkou viacerých kníh a pripravuje najnovšie svoju autobiografiu. Moje meno je Lucia Okšová a teším sa na vás pri ďalšej epizóde nášho podcastu.
Vstúpte s nami do zákulisia sveta, kde sa bežní ľudia nedostanú. Iba Power Players. Pridajte si Power Players medzi svoje obľúbené podcasty a sledujte hru zblízka. Celú epizódu nájdete na forbes.sk. Ďakujeme, že nás počúvate.